reported regularly in the press. Thank you so much. And I also extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists. Dr. Nazneen Ahmed is a popular economist whom everybody knows, and UNDP has now formally, invited her to join, and she's now a country economist of UNDP, and they couldn't have found a better economist than Dr. Nazneen. So welcome. And then there's Dr. Masroor Riaz, whose expertise in the private sector in terms of what really, what are the problems, the key problems in the private sector. He's been researching this and leading the work from the World Bank Group for years together. And so he's not a business leader, but he's a thinker, leading thinker on the business community. On ease of doing business, you would get no other expert than Dr. Masroor. And of course, I have to say something about our keynote presenter today, Dr. Sadiq Ahmad. Dr. Sadiq Ahmad is not known as much to the Bangladesh press as they should. Dr. Sadiq was the director in the World Bank South Asia program. He was country director of Pakistan and Afghanistan. He was chief economist from the World Bank for South Asia. And most importantly, he has, after taking an early retirement from the World Bank, he's one of the founders of Policy Research Institute, along with me and Dr. Ahmed Mansoor. And I would like to inform the media that, Dr. Sadiq Ahmad in the past 10 years has written more books on Bangladesh and more articles on Bangladesh than any other economist of Bangladesh origin. And that, because he spends more time in Washington, unfortunately, we don't get him here. Maybe the media misses him out, but when he talks, you better listen. So I think that's what I would say. And I'm supposed to get only 5 minutes, but this is not part of the 5 minutes. This is the introduction. And I welcome all the other participants who have joined us. There's more than 50, 60 participants, as I can see. The former finance minister, Mr. Said-ur-Zaman, is now with us. Professor Rehman Soman also is supposed to be with us and make comments. And I also recognize the vice chairman of the Export Promotion Bureau, Mr. Ahsan, who's joining us. So there's a whole lot of people from business, academia, policymakers, the company, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for taking the time. Let me say just a few words. This presentation is not just about a study on Vietnam, but I'd like to tell you that there is a new idea. There is a new practice in international trade that we are going to be able to reveal today by studying the experience of Vietnam. Let me read. I usually don't read, but this time, this statement I must read for half a minute. While theories about the gains from trade originated from the minds of thinkers and thought leaders in Europe and North America, the practice of leveraging international trade to transform poor, backward economies into prosperous and developed economies within a time frame of 50 years originated from the leaders and governments of East Asian countries. East Asia has led the way. First, it was Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore in the 1960s and 70s. Then it was China in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, who opened up a hard communist country for trade and investment, calling it socialism with market orientation, giving China 30 years of 10% plus growth. Now it is the turn of another communist country, Vietnam, introducing Doi Moi reforms in 1984, which gave another dose of trade and market orientation into a socialist economy. And the results are before us. Vietnam embraced what we call export-led growth. It is a trade policy paradigm that originated in the 60s, but Vietnam has given it a 21st century twist, and that is what we are going to be talking about. So what is new in this particular 21st version of export or trade-led growth? Export-led growth is actually trade-led growth, bolstered by three new distinctive features of modern international trade. One, unfettered foreign direct investment, FDI. Two, expensive regional and bilateral FTAs, free trade agreements. And three, cross-border global value chain integration. These are the three distinctive elements of this new trade policy, if you may call it. This is a new idea that has emerged. So this is not export-led growth based on the standard comparative advantage principles driven by local resource endowment, because much of it, if not all, the export success that we will be talking about in manufactured products is driven by foreign invested enterprises in Vietnam. The government and local entrepreneurs welcome foreign investment in Vietnam without reservations. And that is the thrust of Vietnam's trade policy. They quoted export-seeking FDI. They quoted FTAs, and they quoted value chain integration, production integration amongst cross-border production integration. Domestic, they've never bothered about domestic value addition, whether it's high, low, no. They're 90% plus of parts and components of Vietnam's big export item, electronic goods. They are imported from outside. Domestic value addition in export is very low, which is why Vietnam exported $281 billion in 2019 with a GDP of $260 billion. Many people will ask this question: how come with a GDP of $260 billion they are exporting? It happens because GDP is all about value addition. Some of value added, and you've got very low value added in these. But that's not the final point I'd like to make is about, is there any anti-export bias in Vietnam? The answer is yes. And although Vietnam has cut its tariffs because of all the FTAs that they have signed, they have reduced tariffs down to about 6 or 7% average. Yet that 6-7% average tariffs gives the domestic market the profitability that local producers find much more attractive than exporting. So the local entrepreneurs, local producers in Vietnam are not the ones that are exporting. It's the foreign investors. That's the story in Vietnam. Now, the question before Bangladesh, of course, is whether, would you like to do that? If you have foreign investors doing all the exporting, local producers in the garment sector in particular, they are local. It's the local entrepreneurs that have done whatever, gains that Bangladesh has achieved, whatever success Bangladesh has achieved in ready-made garment export. Unfortunately, Bangladesh has not been able to, replicate that experience of ready-made garments onto non-ready-made garment export. And that is the critical problem. And we will be talking about that in this particular presentation. I hope I've kept within the 5-7 minutes. And I will now pass on with the permission of our Honorable Minister to Dr. Sadiq Ahmad. The floor is yours, Dr. Sadiq, to give us the details on what really works, what Vietnam has done differently and successfully in the last 2 decades. Over to Dr. Sadiq Ahmad, Vice Chairman of Policy Research Institute, and Bangladesh is one of the leading economists of Bangladesh. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Star. I think Honorable Planning Minister M.A. Mannan, MP, distinguished participants, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. It's my pleasure to share with you the key findings of a research that seeks to explore Vietnam's superb export performance. The research was motivated by a request from the Ministry of Commerce. Let me first admit that neither I nor my co-researchers, Dr. Zaidi Sattar and Dr. Abdul Razak, have ever been to Vietnam. Essentially, this is a desk-based research. But while doing the research, I was fascinated by what I learned. Vietnam experience arguably is the closest one could get to textbook example of a country that did all the right things and got what I think are excellent results. This was a great learning experience for me, and I believe the lessons of this experience from Vietnam are highly relevant to Bangladesh. My presentation is a summary of a more detailed paper that I strongly recommend you read for more in-depth analysis of many of the issues discussed today. The presentation is organized around 4 broad themes. First, very briefly, what is the development context of this research to Bangladesh? Brief analysis of Vietnam's overall development performance, and then a more detailed analysis of Vietnam's export performance and determinants of export performance and lessons for Bangladesh. Having secured major development gains over the past 3 decades, where Bangladesh, as we all know, has climbed from a low-income country status to lower middle-income country status. And we all know that under the Perspective Plan 2041, Bangladesh is now aspiring to become upper middle-income country by 2031 and high-income country by 2041. Among other strategies, trade openness and export-led growth strategies contributed tremendously to the success of Bangladesh development process. As a further input to the formulation of its export promotion strategy, the government is keen to understand how Vietnam has done so well in promoting its export sector. So essentially, the objective of this review is to find out the factors that explain Vietnam's export development experience and what are the possible lessons for Bangladesh. If you look at table 1, if you can do, I think the highlight is that Vietnam is a relatively newcomer to development field. And even as late as 1990, it was a very poor country characterized by a gross national income, per capita income of only US $130, and it a high incidence of extreme poverty of 52% as measured.
We can't hear you. Sadiq bhai, we can't hear you.
Sadiq bhai, you got frozen, your screen and voice.
Be resolved shortly.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Apologies for this technical glitch. The point I was making is Vietnam's experience with development is very recent. You see, within 30 years, and you can see from table 1, basically Vietnam was a very poor country even as late as 1990, with a per capita income of only $130 and poverty incidence of 52%. But in the space of less than 30 years, Vietnam turned around its development performance. Per capita income increased to almost $2,600, growing at a hefty pace of 11%, and poverty fell to below 2%. A more detailed experience, which is in table 2, you can read it offline. Starting from an extremely poor peasant economy in the mid-1980s, it became a thriving upper income, middle income country within a space of 20 years. It started its journey in 1986 with hyperinflation, unsustainable fiscal and balance payments deficits, but they all disappeared. And most importantly, the economic progress has been shared equitably with citizens. Extreme poverty, as I said before, is now virtually eliminated within a space of 30 years, which is remarkable. These are some of the broad characteristics of the Vietnam's development performance. As you can see, the per capita GNI, gross national income, it increased, and the acceleration was especially hefty after 2002. It was funded basically by a high investment rate, which reached almost 36% of GDP. But importantly, and very distinctly from other developing countries, a lot of this was funded by net foreign direct investment, which reached almost over 6.5% of GDP in 2018. Gross domestic saving, of course, was also very substantive, as you can see from there. And most importantly, look at average labor productivity, how rapidly it increased from only $892 in constant $2,000 to $3,505. Importantly, I will emphasize that this productivity improvement and growth improvements was broad-based. Agriculture was a very strong performer. And agriculture, exports, for example, it was also export-led growth in agriculture. Agriculture exports are now $30 billion in Vietnam, which is remarkable. It was a rice deficit country in 1986. It is one of the leading exporters of rice today. Then you look at the other characteristics of Vietnam. Not only look at the export growth in Vietnam from $2 billion in 1990, it reached $260 billion in 2019. Inflation fell from 80% in 1990 to 3 to 4%. Fiscal deficits have stabilized. The tax to GDP ratio increased from 12% in 1992 to 25% in 2019. And look at the extreme poverty from 52.9 to only 1.9. Now, these are some of the characteristics of what the growth experience, which basically shows it was a broad-based growth experience, which was combined with very strong performance on the savings, on investment, on inflation management, on poverty reduction. Just a small, comparison of what the exports or overall summary of the export performance. As I said, in 1990s, both Bangladesh and Vietnam exported $5 billion worth of goods and services. In Bangladesh, it has grown to $45 billion in 2019. In Vietnam, it grew to $280 billion. And you can see how, what the performance gap is. Vietnam is now ranked as the 25th largest exporter in the world when measured in its share of total global exports. A distinct feature of Vietnam's export development is the progress on the technology front. And taking advantage of Vietnam's open door policy for foreign direct investment, Vietnam attracted considerable export-oriented investment in the production and export of high technology products. Even in 2008, the share of technology exports in Vietnam's total export was only 10%. Now it is 40%. And now Vietnam is the 10th largest exporter of technology products in the world. This is remarkable. The changing composition of Vietnam's merchandise export is illustrated in this table 4. Even in 1995, Vietnam was basically exporting mostly primary products, crude oil, coffee, rice, fisheries. Manufactured export was very nominal with garments, footwear, and rubber. But look at 2019. Today, electrical machinery and equipment are the largest component of exports with 36% share. Apparel also has grown to 11%, footwear, industrial machinery, seafood, and etc. You can see the diversification that has happened, which is a remarkable factor. Let's look at this broad-based experience of exports. One important characteristic, as Dr. Zaidistar also pointed out, Vietnam's export performance was led through foreign investment and by through imports. But as you can see from the graph, even though imports and exports grew roughly in parallel, Vietnam still has a substantial trade surplus. In Bangladesh, we have a huge trade deficit. And then another characteristic is that the Vietnam's export performance was manufacturing based with a lot of global value chain participation. And you can see from this chart how Vietnam has grown into the field. It's now the third largest among the countries compared user of global value chain after Malaysia and China. They look at the high share of Vietnam's technical exports in total exports, which has grown exponentially. And then the global exporters of high products, which are ranked here, USA and others, Vietnam is ranked pretty high above Netherlands and Malaysia. The indicators, more quantitative indicators of diversification in terms of export concentration ratio. Look at Bangladesh and Vietnam. They started roughly around the same level of 70% in 2000. Bangladesh further increased to 75%. Vietnam fell, which basically means much more diversification has happened in Vietnam. Similarly, the HHI index, the Hardinfall and Hirschman index, which is another measure of concentration, shows that while Bangladesh export concentration increased, almost doubled, Vietnam's export concentration fell, which means much more diversification. Another aspect of the diversification is what is called the intensive margin and new products. Intensive margin basically means exports from the same product group, and new product margin, of course, is new products. And you can see the gap. Bangladesh 96% expansion of intensive margin, which is not surprising. It's RMG based, whereas in Vietnam it's only 57%, and new products are 44%. Importantly, apart from product diversification, there's also market diversification. And it's reflected both in terms of the top 10 partners, top 20 partners. Again, Vietnam's export diversification in terms of market access is better than Bangladesh, and of course other countries similarly outperform Bangladesh, except maybe Philippines. Summary: Vietnam adopted an export-led growth strategy at its early stage of the Doi Moi regime, which was in 1986, 1990. So, and it stayed with it. There's no second thoughts. Export development was a dynamic process. It started initially by exploiting the low-hanging fruits, minerals and agricultural products, but moved quickly into manufacturing and sophisticated technical products. Export diversification was a built-in strategic element of the export development strategy. It did not allow its export base to remain concentrated in any single product basket. Vietnam diversified both its product as well as export markets. Through its open door policy, foreign investment policy, Vietnam has taken advantage of global export prospects driven by technology. Product development has focused on both vertical and horizontal linkages. The vertical linkages have been basically promoted through participation in the global value chain. This is a unique experience of a developing country. Fundamentally, what explains Vietnam's performance? In summary, the simple point is the main factor that explains Vietnam's export performance is its huge progress with improving global competitiveness. And look at this ranking, and you can see the performance gap between Vietnam and Bangladesh. Vietnam is still below some of the more dynamic countries like Korea, Malaysia, China, but the performance gap with Bangladesh is very large. And as you know, the GCI Competitiveness Index is a summary of almost 12 pillars of growth: institutions, infrastructure, ICT, macro stability, health. So it's a pretty diversified group of policies. And Vietnam's ranking is pretty good. Importantly, if you look at this chart, which shows the areas of progress, and you can see that Bangladesh is the inner circle, the green, which is the in all aspects, Vietnam outperforms Bangladesh, whether it is labor market, product market, macroeconomic stability, etc. So it's a broad-based improvement in the policy framework. Let me now share with you a little bit about the policy framework, so that will help understand where the policy gaps are in Bangladesh. On the monetary and fiscal reforms, as I told you, from a hyperinflation situation, Vietnam very quickly stabilizes its economy through very strong focused monetary and fiscal reform, and it has maintained a prudent macroeconomic strategy throughout. On public enterprise, Vietnam inherited a hugely, because it was a socialist economy, strong public enterprise, but quickly it has gotten rid of most of the small and loss-making SOEs and retained only small and large strategic SOEs, which are profit-making. On the taxation front, a huge adjustment, back from, as I said, it is 12% in 1992. Here it is 21%. The Vietnam's tax to GDP ratio now is 27%, 26%. Importantly, the structure of revenues fell. Vietnam was dependent on oil for its revenue. Now the share of oil in the economy has fallen drastically. Much of the increase in revenues came from corporate taxes, from value-added taxes, and from other sources of fees, etc. Important message. This is very important for Bangladesh, because I'm very, I would say, unhappy with how the exchange rate is managed in Bangladesh, which has appreciated, the real exchange rate is appreciated by almost 80% between 2006 and 2020. That's very difficult for exporters. I must say, I don't know how exporters export, but it is really a very poor management of the real exchange rate. As compared to that, look at the Vietnam's experience. It has not only maintained a very flexible exchange rate management, it has ensured that the exchange rate is broadly supportive of exports. There's a slight upward trend in real exchange rate between 2009 and 2018, but it is mostly run by productivity improvements in the export sector. So it is not penalizing the export sector. Then look at the trade to GDP ratio, not surprised. Look at the gap, where the openness of the economy. Look at the Vietnam's open economy, over 200% trade to GDP ratio versus Bangladesh. Of course, Bangladesh GDP is higher, but it shows that the openness of the Vietnam economy is much more. Vietnam's trade policy, which is the key driver of the export performance, there are three dimensions. One is the sharp reduction in the degree of protection and anti-export bias in the domestic market. A strategy to quote export-seeking FDI without conditions. And third, the thirst for entering into regional and bilateral free trade agreements with a view to opening up duty-free, access to imports. And the ability to reduce the trade protection was facilitated by this FTAs. And as you can see that even as late as 1990s, Vietnam trade regime was protectionist, but then came a sharp reduction in trade protection, especially after it started its journey to free trade agreements. Now it is about 5% for the free trade area and 7% on average. Importantly, the trade reforms or the tariff reforms were not just to manufacturing, it was also applied equally to agriculture. And in fact, the agriculture trade tariffs are even lower than in manufacturing. Look at the gap between the MFN average tariff between Vietnam and Bangladesh. It's huge. This is the point that I had made earlier, the effective rates of protection, where the input tariff and output tariff behavior. Vietnam still has some effective rates of protection, as you can see from the gap between the input and output tariff. But importantly, it is converging. The gap between import and export tariffs output tariffs are converging. And whereas in Bangladesh, this gap has increased, which basically means the effective rates of protection have increased in Bangladesh. A major component of the Vietnam's export strategy is the role of FDI. And to attract FDI, Vietnam invested heavily in human capital and infrastructure. It made large investments in primary and secondary education to ensure adequate supply of skills. It also invested heavily in infrastructure, especially IT, and it made Vietnam a hub of foreign investment for manufacturing, including from Japan, Korea, electronic companies, Samsung, LG, Olympus, Pioneer, and Europe and America. Vietnam is now one of the world's largest producer and exporter of mobile phones, for example. That's an example that happened. A very recent progress. It's now the second largest producer of mobile phones in the world. It has become an attractive place for FDI since its opening up in 1986. There are a few reasons why this happened. One is Vietnam is among the few countries that allows 100% foreign ownership of an enterprise. It also has made radical market-oriented reforms, including trade and investment liberalization. It has achieved high level of trade integration, as I argued earlier, with almost total trade is about 500 billion to 19, which is twice the size of GDP. It has actively courted bilateral and regional free trade agreements. It has focused attention on improving the internal investment climate. The country's overall rank in the ease of doing business has improved from only 104 in 2007 to 70 in 2020. And the inflow of FDI, look at that, from 5 million, only 5 million in 1986, is now 16 billion in 2009. The stock has grown to 161 billion. Manufacturing sector remains the most important source of FDI, but agriculture also has gotten FDI. In 2019, the point Sadiq Bhai made, companies set up under FDI contributed to 71% of country's export revenue. So basically the other 29% came from the domestic investments. Important role of GVC. This is a very important message. Basically, when Vietnam started development, it inherited a dualistic manufacturing sector with a large state-owned enterprise and a small SME privately owned. And the gap between export-led FDI and natural private sector-led SME is still very large. It continues to be so, but I think it's progressively being reduced through improvements in productivity in private sector SMEs. The GVC strategy started by first looking at the low skill processing stage and then slowly moving up the GVC chain through learning by doing based on partnership, employment in FDI enterprise. So the huge learning by doing based on FDI investments in Vietnam. Now Vietnam is developing its capacity through investments in research and development, technology development, and through investment in human capital. Basically, on the key role of the regional trade agreements, and these were done strategically in terms of creation of markets, in terms of creation of technology, and in terms of creation of investment. Importantly, these partnerships or these trade agreements allowed Vietnam to overcome the strong resistance from vested interests domestically. So they could basically refer to these agreements in making these reforms. Very important message. The Vietnam has invested heavily in terms of improving its innovation and technology. It's now listed as 32% of the list of 133 countries. Bangladesh is look at Bangladesh at 116, so the bottom 15%. Progress with ICT is very fundamental, and again, the access of the population that have access to ICT exceeds 50% both cases. Vietnam also placed emphasis on industry research collaboration and training of knowledge workers that have contributed handsomely. Importantly, Vietnam has started investing in R&D. It's still very low, 0.53% compared with the other countries at the bottom of that. But the reason why it has scored so well on the FDI, on the technology exports is because of the partnership with the FDI that has allowed it to acquire skills and move forward with the investments. And a very important message. This message is the role of trade logistics, and you can see at the graph there is a positive correlation between improvement in trade logistics exports, and Vietnam has done tremendously well, as you can see from all the areas, and this progress was broad-based. Final message: Vietnam's strong emphasis on human capital. Vietnam spends 5% of GDP on education and training, 2% on health, and 6% on social protection. So combined spending on human capital is 13%, whereas Bangladesh spends only 3.6% of GDP on human development. And you can see both from, in terms of quality, the HCI index and the PISA show that Vietnam's performance in skill development is outstanding. Finally, the final slide. What are the lessons for Bangladesh? First lesson is, since the early days of adoption of Doi Moi strategy, Vietnam put unwavering commitment to implementing an export-led government-led growth strategy. This is the important message. If you want to have an export-led strategy, this must be consistently followed. No ifs and buts. It recognized that successful pursuit of export-led growth strategy can only coexist with a trade policy that lowers trade restriction and avoid trade policy related and export bias. This is a huge issue in Bangladesh. They really need to come to grips. If they want to live with export promotion strategy, they have to reduce the trade production bias. Vietnam took comprehensive policy reform to improve the investment climate. We now know we still are very low. We have made some progress, but we are still very low on the cost of doing business. They took an early measures to stabilize the macroeconomy. Tax to GDP ratio is now almost 26%. Our tax to GDP ratio is only 9%. Vietnam has managed its exchange rate policy successfully. We have a serious problem with our exchange rate, which has appreciated over by 90% in the last 10 years in real terms. Vietnam made strong progress in trade logistics. We still are lagging in that area. Vietnam took strong advantage of GVC. We do not have a GVC strategy in Bangladesh. Vietnam has a strong investment in FDI. Our FDI is less than 1% of GDP. A strong investment in human capital, as I said, 12% of GDP. We are spending only 3 to 4%. Important message is that through this massive spending on human capital, Vietnam has ensured that the benefits of growth are shared equitably. Vietnam has now eliminated extreme poverty, a dream which we are still pursuing. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sadiq, for this extensive, very comprehensive piece of research and presentation. It would be difficult for me to summarize, but I'll take a couple of points that are striking, I think. First of all, I think there are ideas coming out of this particular experience of Vietnam for academics in Bangladesh, as well as the business leaders in Bangladesh. So there is, in practice, as well as in theoretical research, there are lessons coming out of this. Dr. Sadiq has told us, he's made a lot of, comparisons between Bangladesh and Vietnam, and some of them are really striking. Like Vietnam had exports of about $2 billion in 1990. Now it has $280 billion in 2019. I don't know of any other country whose exports have grown that fast. Vietnam has a diversified export basket, like Bangladesh, which everybody talks about, export concentration. And I think it's important to remember when Dr. Sadiq pointed out that 70% of Vietnam's exports are FDI driven, 30% is local. Those 30% are primarily agricultural exports. Vietnam is #2 exporter of coffee, poised to be #1, going over Brazil very shortly. Vietnam is #2 exporter of rice after India. Vietnam is #2 exporter of mobile telephones after China. And in the case of apparels, everybody knows Vietnam became #2, but this year, I think 2021, Bangladesh will again become #2. That's my expectation based on it. So there's a lot of interesting messages coming out of the Vietnam experience. So I cannot take any more time. I would like to pass on. I would like to invite Mr. Rizwan Rahman, President of the Dhaka Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Rizwan Rahman, I consider as the young generation entrepreneur, business leader, and one of those who will be the future generation of entrepreneurs and business. We wish you all success in the future. Rizwan Rahman.
Thank you,
The floor
sir.
is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely delighted to be here, as I mentioned, in a star-studded diaspora. But also, I had to take 2 shots of espresso to absorb that presentation. And of course, absolutely delighted to see our chief guest, my very favorite Mr. M. Mannan. And thank you also for letting me speak before Mr. Syed Nasim Manzoor and Dr. Rubana Haq. I have been noticing they have been taking notes and probably created a thesis out of this presentation. But I am going to stick to broad stroke agenda and try not to sound like an expert, which I'm not. But what I've observed from the presentation is that the interesting fact that the extreme poverty and the inflation graph, which I saw on the presentation, it was really stagnant. It's very stable. And of course, 36% of the exports is actually coming in from crude oil. So of course, they have a comparative advantage over a lot of countries, to be honest. But if I go to checking how Bangladesh's exports have declined in 2020, and we have seen a 15% rise in 21. Vietnam has actually increased despite the pandemic, 6%. And then, of course, we also recently saw the upgradation of Vietnam to become the second largest exporter of RMG in the world, just overtaking Bangladesh, which, to be honest, we were expecting at any time now, and it did happen eventually. But also, they have also specialized in exports of machineries, mechanical appliances, nuclear reactors and boilers. And those specific sectors also have a 41% increase in exports. At the same time, if you compare Bangladesh, of course, it's a really small industry, the light engineering sector. They have seen 81% growth, a couple of 100 million. 81% growth, which is a very positive improvement from the previous year. And to answer your question of today's webinar, what lessons can Vietnam take? What lessons can Bangladesh take from this Vietnam's success story? So the Doi Moi policy that Dr. Sadiq Ahmad has highlighted today, which is from the 80s, and they have been very stringent about following certain policies to export-led diversification. Now, Bangladesh, of course, the lesson they can take is export basket diversity, and of course, local industry development, which I'm very, very vocal about, especially in my capacity as president of BCCI. And I think that these two issues are now being addressed. I must give that credit to the government, because they also have the fear of the challenges of the LDC graduation. So if you want to be competitive in the industry alongside your neighbors, you have to diversify your export basket and local industry development. But at the same time, Vietnam does have a lot of FTAs, whether it's bilateral, multilateral, and part of ASEAN as well. So Bangladesh needs to enforce on those free trade agreements or any forms of agreements. I know they're trying to concentrate on RCEP right now, and then there's SIPA, and of course, various others, and ASEAN as well. At the same time, I think that this needs to be effective, and especially when it comes to negotiations of these FTAs, to make sure that Bangladesh does not only benefit from those markets that they're trying to sign their agreements with, but at the same time, they must also be open to opening up their own markets to those countries. And of course, I also think that another policy that the government should take, something we've always been talking about, the access to finance. So we need to promote credit insurance for exporters, for taking loans from credit organizations. And this is something which is followed in Vietnam. And I think that the conventional banking system is no longer the main access, the main financier in projects. So we need to step out of that and look for parallel access to finance. And of course, like I said earlier, reviewing the investment policies that we have. So we need to acknowledge the fact that FDI is important, even though we are having less than 1% contribution to GDP. But the success story of the Doi Moi in the 80s should be a clear example of how fast Vietnam has escalated. And this can actually attract not only foreign, but also domestic investments in export production, which actually may be followed. And again, infrastructure, huge transport communication, warehouses, seaports, customs clearance sites. These are very essential to ease international trade, and at the same time, continuous development of human resources through training, focused industrial learning, reskilling and upskilling of development of each and every industry. I just read that Vietnam spends 12% of their GDP on human development. I don't think we are even a tenth of that. So 3 challenges right now Bangladesh has to be in the competition, to be successful in the race they're already in. One is, of course, the first phase, which is the pandemic recovery, and then coming on to the LDC graduation. And of course, there's a 4th industrial revolution that is much talked about, But at the same time, I also feel that in certain sectors, Bangladesh is still facing the challenges of the second industrial revolution. For example, the light engineering sector. And I'm not going to elaborate on these details because each one of us are well aware of all this. But in some cases, I think the long story short, just one message to the chief guest: we don't want any more Samsungs stepping away from Bangladesh. The race must go on. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Rizwan. Wonderful presentation. You covered a lot of ground. Some of the things that business leaders in Bangladesh are concerned about and they're looking forward to. The last item that you mentioned, light engineering, or electronic products, I think that is a future that we should be looking forward to. But I have to ask one little question, which is that we have a tariff issue in that sector, which tells me that selling in the domestic market, they are so well protected that selling in the domestic market is much more profitable than exporting. So would the private sector be actually keen on exporting or selling in the domestic market in this particular potential, very high potential sector called electronics and electrical products? I'm looking forward to much greater exports there. I would now like to invite Syed Naseem Mansoor, former president of Metropolitan Chamber, but more importantly, a leading spokesperson of the Bangladesh entrepreneurs and business leaders and the business sector overall. Syed Naseem Mansoor, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, or good morning still to everybody. Thank you, Chair, Dr. Zaidi Sattar, keynote presenter, Dr. Sadiq Ahmad, distinguished panelists, special guests, and of course, our favorite chief guest, who always encourages us to speak out, sometimes too much, but I think we follow your example, sir, of trying to tell where the shoe pinches. As a shoe person, I want to thank PRI for this excellent and I would say eye-opening presentation on what Vietnam has done well, but more importantly, what we can take away. I think I have to quote something that Dr. Sadiq said. I don't know how exporters export. I don't want to quote out of context. That was in the context of exchange rates, about which Rubana Appa and I have been screaming for, I think, more than a decade now. And real effective exchange rate, REER, I remember when we first started talking about it at MCCI 10 years ago, we were told that we were being, I think the word was paranoid. So I'm really glad that at least we can discuss this openly now in the presence of our leaders. Quickly, just to give a context of where we stand in the industry that I work in, which is footwear, to show how well Vietnam has done. And I think we should not be afraid to recognize when competition does well, so that we can learn from them, and what we can adapt, and many things we can't, simply because of the difference of the two economies. Vietnam is the second largest exporter of footwear in the world and does about $22.07 billion worth of footwear exports last year. They did about 1.23 billion pairs at an average price of about $18, and they consumed 309 million pairs. Bangladesh is the 17th largest. We are 17, they're second. They did $22.07 billion. We did $943 million. They did 1.23 billion pairs. We did 72 million pairs. This is only export. Their average selling price was $17.90, and our average selling price was $13.08. We are ranked 366. We are in the world in terms of consumption, million pair. Vietnam is 6.4% of global footwear production. We are 2.1%. But in terms of the export orientation of the Vietnam footwear industry, it's 93.4%. So their entire footwear industry has been created and driven towards export, and they have created that playing field for that. Bangladesh, on contrary, our export orientation of our footwear industry is 17.1%. So they're at 93, we're at 17. Now, there are pros and cons to this. We absolutely believe and support the growth of domestic demand and consumption. But I want to use this as a way to segue into the first point, I think that Dr. Sadiq has made so brilliantly, which is the importance of FDI beyond dollars. Connection to global value chains, value addition, product diversification, market diversification, marketing muscle. The top 5 exporters in Vietnam of footwear are 5 Korean joint venture factories that have been there average since 1994. The single largest exporter in Vietnam is a company called Changshin Korea, which has been there since is Taekwang Korea, 1994, Nike. They do $1.2 billion of footwear exports. They employ about 50,000 people. So I think sometimes we confuse ourselves. We need FDI, we don't need FDI. As Rizwan Rahman said, stay the course. If you believe there is a value in FDI, we need to stay the course. Not to be driven, I would say, I think the word of export-led growth, I would say rather exports facilitated growth, but the growth has to come from FDI and FDI has to be welcome. Second, as I think has been pointed out, from doi moi to currency to zones to export policy, they have been consistent. There has not been a flip-flop of policy, which we see, unfortunately, in Bangladesh. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes local, sometimes export. Oh, remittance, what should be the exchange rate? Or dollar, what should be the exchange rate? This constant flip-flopping in public does not create confidence amongst investors. Local first, foreign second. We must be clear. What do we want to do? What can we achieve? And we have preeminent economists in front of whom I dare not speak, but there have been proven records of how these can be managed. And I think the third point, which brings me to, is focus on countries which are FDI stock. If you look at what happened with FDI in Vietnam, you can name the countries: South Korea, 70 billion, Japan, 60 billion, Singapore, 55 billion, Taiwan, 33 billion. They didn't go all across the world. They focused, and with some of these countries, specifically Japan and Korea, we have excellent relations, Bangladesh, but we have not been able to attract. Now they're coming, and this is a good move. Fourth, competitiveness. Whether it is cost of land, where Bangladesh is making strides, whether it's predictability of wage increase. Of course, there must be wage increase. Wages must go up. Real wages have to go up, but there must be predictability of what that is. Tariff. Thank you so much, Dr. Sadiq, for talking about tariff. Bangladesh cannot remain protectionist and still expect to participate in FTAs. It's a non-starter. You've got to bring down your tariff rates. If Vietnam can be at an average of 5 and we're at 27, you've lost the game even before you've started on a tariff negotiation. Number 5, ease of doing business. And we all know about this. Now, specific examples. I was talking to, we have a Taiwanese joint venture who have factories in Vietnam, 2 and 1 in Bangladesh. And this morning I called him. I said, Jim, why do you prefer to work in Vietnam and not Bangladesh? He said 2 things. From the time that I land in the airport, and I'm sorry, sir, for saying this, but I have to say this, I've been saying this for many years. It takes too long. I'm not sure how long I'm going to be in traffic. So that first impression is very important, sir. There's got to be softer things that we can do to improve that impression. That's on a softer side. On the hard side, customs clearance. Average customs clearance time in Vietnam is 2 to 3 working days, regardless of who you are, what trade body you belong to, which sector you belong to. It does not matter. In Bangladesh, we have now situations 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. Even garment factories are struggling to clear, and garment is the gold standard of what is possible with policy. So if garments is struggling, you can imagine what's happening to the rest of the export. Connectivity, number 6, logistics. Very, 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 very important. Today, speed to market is as important as price. If you see Spain and Portugal gaining share at the expense of Bangladesh and India, it's because speed to market. They can turn around faster. The differences in prices, thanks to logistics, are going down. On the World Bank Logistics Performance Index, Vietnam is at 45, Bangladesh is at 100. We don't talk about logistics enough. What is the cost of transporting goods? Not about the container rates that we know about, but Dhaka to Chittagong. Why have they gone up 3 times just because container rates have gone up 5 times? I don't find logic to this, and no one can explain this to me. Number 7, thank you, thank you, thank you, currency. Honestly speaking, there is no discussion on currency. The Trump administration had accused Vietnam of being a currency manipulator before he exited. The Biden administration has stopped that discussion. They have used currency extremely judiciously to boost competitiveness, not at the cost of local industry, not at the cost of inflation, but they used currency, as has Japan, as has Taiwan, as has Korea, as has Thailand. We don't have those discussions. Last but not least, incentivizing local government and low-level government employees to facilitate business. We find extremely high buy-in on the importance of ease of doing business at the highest levels of government, at the minister level, at the secretary level. When we get right down to the ports, to the police, to the customs, that's where we run into trouble. And I think this is where a mind shift needs to happen. And we have seen in Vietnam, as in China, individual regions competing for factories, individual regions being incentivized and empowered to offer fiscal policies which will help set up factories. Rizwan Rahman said, we don't want to lose another Samsung to Vietnam. I would say that we are losing even within country, right? Certain areas are getting more. Here, there is a lot that can be done. So I will conclude by saying, I think if I have to talk about three things: competitiveness, Bangladesh is at the risk of losing competitiveness prematurely; logistics, and you have to change the mindset where we cannot flip-flop about, do we need FDI? Don't we need FDI? We want FDI only here. We don't want FDI there. I think a time has come to understand the value of FDI beyond the dollars that it brings. And that is why Vietnam today, 72% of Vietnam's exports come from FDI created firms. Thank you very much for this opportunity to PRI.
Thank you, Naseem Mansoor, for specifying the issues that that are of concern to the business sector in Bangladesh, and what Bangladesh is missing and what Bangladesh needs to do. You've been very precise on those points. Thank you so much. I agree. You know, when it comes to exchange rates, there is something. You know, this is based on cross-country research coming from Professor Danny Roderick, who says that all the export successes, you know, countries that have had export success like China and now Vietnam, you can call them currency manipulators, but what basically they have been doing is keeping their exchange rate depreciated rather than overvalued. So that is a consistent policy by economies that have succeeded in their exports. You've also mentioned FTAs. Yes. What Vietnam has done is sign FTAs with big regions, big countries, right, left, and center. Today, they have FTAs which gives them near zero tariff access to about 70% of global GDP. Global GDP is only $80 trillion, 70% they cover. And more than 50% of global trade. That is their access in terms of FTAs. So this is just fantastic. Now, I think without much ado, I'd like to go over to Dr. Rubana Haq, and Nihat Kabir has joined us, President of NCCI. You'll follow Dr. Rubana Haq. Rubana, it's your floor.
Thank you, Zaidi Bhai. Thank you, Sadiq Bhai, for a great report. It was a great read. Of course, Honorable Minister, all protocols observed. Let me just start with saying that, you know, we probably need to also refer to a case of Samsung in Vietnam. So in 2015, Samsung sent around 60 firms and they just invested in Vietnam because they sent their molding experts for detailed training programs, and they made engineers and technicians, and then almost 200 consultants were created in Vietnam in between 2018 and 19. So a pool of productivity consultants was grown by Samsung in Vietnam in 2015. So we need to be aware of how to engage and with who to engage. Bangladesh immediately needs a sector diversification policy. And for this, this sector diversification policy must not rule out SMEs, because SMEs have to be linked to FDI as well. And we must also have at least, you know, MNEs as inward investors in Bangladesh. So we cannot be averse to FDI as we traditionally position ourselves. I think it's time for us to realize a few truths. And that is, we cannot have knee-jerk reactions when exports from Vietnam in garments exceeds Bangladesh. I mean, let's stop panicking about that. Let's think about where to diversify and how to diversify instead of just always protecting RMG, because that should not be the key. Even we want to now go into multiple areas. There are so many sectors that we can go into. And number one, recycled yarn is there. Almost 25 to 47% of resources are discarded. Number two, we can go into polyester staple fiber production. We have Mamanu Polyester Industry Limited in Manila. So, we have that. We can go into solar PV module assembly. We can go into, of course, light engineering, automotive upholstery, hair accessories, so fashion accessories, heritage product. And let's not forget about the new service economy. That's another area where Vietnam has concentrated. If you go through the report, it clearly talks about the new service economy as well. So basically the non-factor services, it's around 16.6 million, and it's going up. It's on travel, tourism, everything. So, and tech services, of course. So this is another area that Bangladesh needs to wake up to. It is time for new service economy as well, apart from manufacturing. So I had a question to Sadiq Bhai about the productivity increase. I think, very often when we talk about appreciation, and Naseem is so right, we've been screaming our lungs out about appreciation of our currency, which has actually appreciated almost 6.1% according to the report itself in the last couple of years. But it also must be offsetted by productivity. And this is a point that the report makes very, very clearly. But what I was very curious about was, I saw that in the report you've read that major reforms led to major state-owned entities' productivity. That got my attention, that state-owned enterprises recorded higher productivity rates. So that was interesting for us to observe. And like Naseem said, it is a question about policy continuity. That does not happen. And of course, investment in human resources, which does not quite happen all that much also. Let's talk about the economic complexity. And it's true that so far in economic complexity, we've ranked very low. I think we're 100 out of 144, whereas Vietnam is at I think 41. So this is something we need to also understand. And at the same time, what are we actually focusing on? Are we focusing on intensive margins or extensive margins? We are always exporting the same 5 products from Bangladesh that Bangladesh does. And more and more. The quantities are going up. And at an average, we've had a 2.35% drop in prices from EU. So it's a question of choosing the products also. It's just not sector diversification. It is also a question of product diversification. Talking about FTAs, I wish, Sadiq Bhai, next time, please help us with focusing on FTAs, because EV-FTA is going to become a huge issue for Bangladesh on the 6th year. Let's just keep have reality checks. And we can't go on with that rhetoric about Bangladesh is resilient and we will go on. Of course we will go on. We have gone on so far. We are like Phoenix. We do rise from the ashes, but that should not exclude the possibility of not having an export growth. Bangladesh does need there are plush toys that we can do. So many other examples are there. One important takeaway from the report was the concentration on Vietnam's export relationships. I thought that was a marvelous point, because Bangladesh loses out on export relationships and Vietnam doesn't. Of course, last but not the least, I must thank, there is in page 31, there is a very nice comment on incentives. Usually, I'm please don't take me up on this and say that, I favor incentives. It's not that, but it was good to notice that, challenges fueled by exporters, and I'm reading from the report, particularly small and new ones in respect of incentives and trade logistics are also to, I thought that was a fair point to make. So incentives are needed when, of course, there is no productivity when there are not ample investment in human development. I think I've said enough. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Deeply appreciate the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabana. You're well spoken as always, and you make some very, very striking points. The last one being on incentives. You see, we have been, PRI has been, exposing a fundamental conflict that we see in our trade regime, trade policy regime, and the incentive regime. When we talk of incentive, it's about incentivizing exports versus incentivizing production for the domestic market. This is the comparison we always do, and we find that the incentive system is skewed against exports. Unfortunately, people don't seem to understand how that can happen. We do so much for export. Yeah, we do so much for ready-made garment export. That's true. But when it comes to other exports in Bangladesh, you mentioned that Bangladesh does not have comparative advantage just in ready-made garment because it's a labor-intensive product. No, but there are so many other labor-intensive products. Toys, as you just mentioned, footwear, as you just mentioned. Unless the incentive is properly maintained between exports and selling in the domestic market, exports are going to lose out, particularly non-garment exports. And that is where I think we face a big challenge. May I now invite Nihat Kabir, who has joined us, President of the Metropolitan Chamber. Nihat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sadiq bhai. Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon good morning still to everyone present, particularly our honorable chief guest. And I can see Professor Rahman Subhan, Dr. M. Said Zaman, and many other very eminent guests here. I wish I had been able to have a bit more time to read and absorb the entire report and not just parts of it, which I tried to focus on. I worked in Vietnam when I was with the Asian Development Bank in the late 90s. And I have to say the experience there was not great. I remember waiting in the Ministry of Finance in Hanoi, and there was a very sad-looking Vietnamese government official who had spent 7 days in Hanoi. He had come from Ho Chi Minh City for the permission to buy a few hundred, I think it was $700 worth of equipment. From there, today, we are setting up Vietnam as a model or as a target for us to achieve. So they must have done something very, very right. I don't want to go into the findings and the specifics of either the report or the excellent presentation that Dr. Sadiq Ahmad made, because most of the comments that I would have wanted to make have been made by Syed Naseem Manzoor and Dr. Rabana Haq. As a practitioner, I would like to know this. In Bangladesh, for the last 7 years, we've been saying that our policies are all in place, and on paper, a lot of the policies are there. The foreign exchange regime, the import-export regime, I mean, on paper, it's all excellent. It's like, we are saying that, look here, we've got a beautiful shop set up. Why are people going to the neighborhood chai dokan and instead of coming to my beautifully appointed shop? But we are not going out and asking those people, what exactly is the problem? I asked the chairman of BIDA the other day that because there was another study, there was a presentation in BIDA itself where one of the points was made that we should, the researchers said that we should have exit interviews with foreign investors who are leaving Bangladesh. Forget having exit interviews with foreign investors who are leaving Bangladesh. Do we actually keep in touch with investors who are in Bangladesh? Do we ask them what they need? And when I asked this question, the answer was that, there is no systemic mechanism for our policymakers to get this feedback from the existing investors. We go out on these roadshows, but do we actually engage with specifically with the investors we want to target and attract to Bangladesh? Or is it just a scattershot, broad-based approach? We've had a roadshow, we've said that we have a beautiful place, come and invest. But we are not asking people what they really want. And we are not offering it to them. So I want to move on to actually the hows of it. As a practitioner, as a practicing lawyer, because I keep getting asked these questions, what is the actual mechanism for doing what Vietnam did? How did they go about structuring the FTAs, which will actually, even at the time when they entered most of these FTAs, their bargaining power was not great. How did they leverage what they have into getting FTAs, which are giving them this very beneficial access to all the markets that they're getting now? As I had said in a previous webinar, I think our Honorable Chief Guest was there as well. Where is our fear of getting into these FTAs that we have only so far got in one with Bhutan? Do we have the negotiating capacity in our research institutes to give us the information we need, and in our civil servants who will negotiate these FTAs to get the best out of it? Do they link up with the businesses to find out what we really need? I don't see that happening. We are talking about foreign exchange. We were having again this conversation with the private sector advisor as well, that what it is the Central Bank of Vietnam does or allows to be done that we don't. On paper, our foreign exchange regime has been very good for the last 30 years, not even the last 10, compared to, say, India, compared to other regional countries. Is it only in implementation that we fall apart? Or are we also now falling behind in the policy decisions, which need to be reflected in our regulatory frameworks? We talk about skill and education. Do we have a targeted plan that what it is we want out of our system of imparting skills or imparting education? A student having come out after 10 years of formal education in Bangladesh, what are the qualities that students should have? What are the skills that students should have, that young person should have? And what it is that Vietnam has done, what is it in the content of the curriculum, in the manner of the education that they give, that is making the difference there? We talk about, the study has talked about locking in reforms. We've talked about that endlessly in Bangladesh. It really is time that we now walk the walk and not just talk the talk. We have talked about the global value chain. How do we get into it? Today, my question is, this is an excellent study, but what are the mechanisms? What are the actual practical mechanics of getting these done in Bangladesh? One question I've always had, which then economists will perhaps be able to answer, is that how much of a role has geopolitics had in the initial rise of Vietnam's economy? And Naseem mentioned we have very good relationships with several of the countries that Vietnam has excellent relationships. Why have we not been able to leverage that relationship into better economics? And finally, we need to get over our suspicion of both business and foreign investment. Even today, I hear policymakers saying, as previous speakers have said, আমাদের দেশে কি ফরেন ইনভেস্টমেন্টের দরকার আছে? ওরা অল্প টাকা নিয়ে এসে অনেক বেশি টাকা নিয়ে চলে যায়। I was in court in a case yesterday, and this was again one of the themes that came up. So this is a suspicion that pervades our entire thought process. And until we get out of that, I don't think that in practice we are going to move fast enough to catch up with our competitors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nihad. You've hit the nail on the head. আমাদের কি ফরেন ইনভেস্টমেন্ট দরকার আছে? এরা অনেক বেশি কম টাকায় নিয়ে এসে বেশি টাকা নিয়ে যায়। Well, that is a problem in understanding of what foreign investment is all about. It's not the money that they bring in, not the capital they bring in. They bring in, technology. They bring in they bring in innovation. They bring in new management. They bring in markets. That's really important. And Vietnam, look at what Vietnam has been doing. They now have FTAs with 70% of the world market. They have this market access. I mean, when you have that kind of market access, how that takes away all the competition, really. So thank you you've made several points. I've been, short of time now, otherwise I would have gone into some of the discussion. May I now invite our distinguished panelists now. I think it's their turn. Dr. Nazneen Ahmed has been waiting for a long time. Dr. Nazneen, it's your floor, and I know we're going to hear some very striking messages coming out from you. Personally, I hope it may not be the UNDP message. I guess this is in your personal capacity. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's still 4 minutes to go to afternoon, so I can still say good morning. And thank you, Policy Research Institute, for inviting me to this important event. Honorable Chief Guest, honorable special guests, and I can see Professor Rehman Subhan, Mr. M. Saiduzzaman, and all the distinguished other participants. Good morning to all of you. And Sadiq Bhai, thank you very much to you and your team for bringing us here on a really very important topic, the wonderful work that you did, because the business leaders have spoken extensively on different issues. I will not repeat those things, and also I will not repeat what Sadiq Bhai mentioned in his analysis. I agree to all of them. But what I want to add is what Barrister Nihat Kabir mentioned regarding the behind the scene activities, those were there. And that actually played the role, where she mentioned that the negotiation skills, the linking of knowledge and the negotiation skills, and what Vietnam did in that line. So what I intend to focus on is how the economic policies of Vietnam was also linked to is foreign policies. So that's very important, another learning point. And if we look there, that what they did regarding their foreign policies, and I can see that Vietnam's socioeconomic development strategy of 2011 to 2020, which was obviously initiated in 2011, and that emphasized on the importance of international integration. So it's not only export-led growth per se, as Zaidi Bhai mentioned in the beginning. So their focus was on international integration by making every effort in broadening external relations. I'm actually reading out from one of their policies, broadening external relations, engaging proactively in international integration, and raising Vietnam's international profile. So I can see that in 2008, when Vietnam was still having a per capita income of $1,000 around, at that time, they took an initiative of improving their capacity in economic diplomacy. Where I agree to all the points made by Sadiq Bhai on developing our local base and economic issues and other things, it's very important how we actually formulate our foreign policy that can go along with our economic policy. And there, Vietnam invested extensively in improving their negotiation capacity of government officials, of the business leaders. And back in 2008, they invested extensively on developing economic diplomacy. I think when we say that Vietnam now has lots of FTAs, PTAs, FDI, that those foreign policy actually played a big role. I think in Bangladesh, it's very important that our business leaders, our commerce ministry, our foreign ministry and of course, economic relations division, ERD, and together with planning commission, because the planning minister is here, they should work together. So it's not just you develop everything, and then as Nihat Kavir mentioned, that we don't know what those investors want. So economic diplomacy and our negotiation skill will actually expose those needs from the foreign investors. So because there are a lot other speakers who will speak, I would like to say that we have to learn from Vietnam's foreign policy also, and how they integrated their foreign policy with their economic policy. And I will just like to say that in the beginning, Rizwan Rahman from Dhaka Chamber rightly mentioned that now is a time to look at this integration of foreign policy and economic policy together, when we are actually in the process of when we will, because from LDC graduation. And we all know that a high-powered committee has been established in the Prime Minister's office, and it has 6 subcommittees. But in my view, there are subcommittees on intellectual property right, market access, and others. But a smooth transition strategy has been noted there as a subcommittee. I think it's very important that actually this should be our main goal, to develop a smooth transition strategy, which is very pro towards export growth, towards enhancing foreign investment and everything. So it's not as a subcommittee it should work. I think that should be the umbrella committee, which will actually be well coordinated with other committees. And there, I think it's a very important component should be enhancing the overall foreign integration strategy of Bangladesh. And that should not be only a foreign policy, it should integrate the economic aspects and demands from the business community. And we need to build a bridge between the knowledge community, like the research organizations, and those who will be doing the diplomacy. It's very important in line with LDC graduation, because we are doing lots of things, lots of planning has been going on. This is a chance where we can integrate all these issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nazneen. Excellent points, no question about it. I think this is you've brought in some fresh outlook on this subject, international diplomatic relations. Sometimes diplomatic relations precede trade, and it's just as important to have good negotiation skills, because economic diplomacy succeeds when you have good negotiators. Quite honestly, we are exploring the options of signing on free trade agreements with many countries, many regions, but the traction, we have not got any traction yet, because part of the problem is negotiation skills, and but the bigger problem, I think, is that we have really built up high tariff walls. And the first item on the agenda when you start talking about free trade agreements is what do you do with the tariffs? And it doesn't go very far after that. So anyway, we are hopeful that something will happen in the near future. Thank you for your excellent points. May I now invite Dr. Masroor? I recognize we have Mr. Saiduzzaman, Professor Rahman Soman, all waiting to speak, and we are waiting to listen. There's Dr. Salim Raihan, many more, very distinguished speakers out there. We will give you the time and chance to speak, sir. Masroor, again, a private sector specialist, spent a lot of time trying to ease doing business. So he has a lot of experience on how to remove the barriers to business and investment. So Masroor, it's your floor.
Thank you, Dr. Sattar, and thank you for your very kind introduction as well. Today's chair, Dr. Sattar, chief guest, Minister M.A. Mannan, keynote speaker, Dr. Sadiq Ahmad, and all protocols observed. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. And I think we have just broke into the afternoon, so a very good afternoon. So first of all, I'd like to thank PRI and PRI's leadership and the authors for inviting me here as a distinguished panelist, focusing on what I feel is a highly relevant, highly timely, highly focused study that could not have come at a better time. I want to focus on three broad areas within the next 5-6 minutes. I know many other very distinguished participants would speak, so I'd like to be as brief as I can. The first broad area I want to highlight is the relevance of this analytical piece or this report. I would like to congratulate PRI and the authors for undertaking an initiative which could not have had more relevant for Bangladesh in terms of several areas: the time relevance, the benchmark country relevance, and the report focus or the analytical focus relevance. Why I say timely relevance? LDC graduation impending, COVID hit has hurt. I think export diversification and export competitiveness enhancement, the imperative could not have been more realistic for us. We have no time to lose. The second one, in terms of time relevance, is the jobs imperative. I think the jobs are going to be the key way for us to get out of poverty, to move to the next phase of our development trajectory. However, the job creation rate has been slowing down. By 2016-17, before COVID, the growth rate in employment creation came down from 3.1 to 1.8%. And RMG, which has been carrying the burden of creating formal sector jobs for very long, has been growing at between 2010 and 16 or 17. The output has been growing at 14%, but the job creation rate has been 66%. So it's about time, high time, other sectors and our export basket broaden to actually help Bangladesh create the jobs, the more and better jobs that it needs to break into the higher middle income and the developed country vision that it has. Benchmark country relevance. Vietnam and Bangladesh has many similarities. The growth strategy has been export driven. The growth has been robust. We had 10, 12 years of 6% average growth rate. Vietnam had 30 years of 6.6% average growth rate for several decades. We both started with a difficult baseline. 1971, right after the independence, we started with very little infrastructure and many other basic, very limited services. So did Vietnam after the 75, 76 end of the war. The reforms started pretty much in similar time, 80s, and then obviously intensified in Bangladesh, particularly in the 90s. Export concentration is something that Vietnam doesn't have now, but they did struggle with export concentration in the 80s and 90s as well. I mean, if we look at East Asia, which is on an average has done better in terms of export diversification, but there are variation among the countries. Countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, they always have had a historically until recently higher concentration compared to countries like China, Thailand, Indonesia. Electronics and mechanical items export. Vietnam had only 9% in 2005. Within 10 years, 2016, 35%. That's the level. And yet, this is a country which has reached a $279 billion of export, 6% of FDI GDP ratio, and we are yet to catch up significantly. And in terms of focus relevance, I think the report focuses on the export readiness and the export growth drivers, such as infrastructure and logistics, productivity, market access, trade policy and facilitation, standards, and so on. My second broad focus area, all lessons drawn up by Dr. Sattar, Dr. Ahmed, and Dr. Razak, all are very important and sheds excellent light or throws excellent light for Bangladesh. But the ones which I feel are the most relevant in the context of Bangladesh's own challenges as well as the opportunities, there are several. First, Vietnam shows us the benefit of holistic and consistent policy planning followed by specific strategies to implement those planning. We have heard about Doi Moi, which is renovation. I mean, on the broader enabling environment, infrastructure, macroeconomy, it has led to the liberalization. But what Vietnam has till date for their priority sectors, they have 5-year sector development strategies. And each of the sector development strategies are accompanied by a sector FDI strategy and the sector export strategy, which we, Bangladesh, do not have. Agro-processing, food sector, which is not even anywhere close to sort of the importance or attention the footwear or the electronic sector gets in Vietnam or RMG, $35 billion of export 2 years ago. And Vietnam's target is to export $70 billion within next 9 years. I think Bangladesh's total export target in next 5 years is perhaps $60 billion plus. Another area where Vietnam broke really sort of significantly, market access. And for market access, they use 2 instruments very strongly. First, the FTAs, and we all talked, our previous speakers talked about FTAs, Zaidi Bhai and Sadiq Bhai talked about it. Vietnam has more than 13, including several, with the regional blocks, European Union, ASEAN. I mean, Bangladesh have 1 PTA. Just to give you an example, what it sort of enables Vietnam to have in terms of competitiveness. With the European Union FTA they have in 2019, by the time it's implemented, the agro products will have 1.1% access duty in European markets from Vietnam. And the agro-processed products are going to have just 2.1% tariff to enter European market. Compare that with perhaps double digits that Bangladesh will have to pay later on. A second area they used for market access is environmental, social, and quality standards, particularly quality where Bangladesh falls behind. And Vietnam has a national quality infrastructure and the national quality strategy underpinned by a law. 47% of Vietnam's national standards are harmonized with international standards, which enable them to access international markets very smoothly. Logistics infrastructure, which Nasim Bhai spoke very sort of eloquently about, but Dr. Sadiq Ahmad also shed light. It's about 15 to 20% of Vietnam's GDP now. Vietnam has a logistics law, it has a logistics strategy, and overall, Bangladesh lacks far behind. We do not have a logistics policy, strategy, or law, and logistics costs are as high as 50% in Bangladesh, whereas the ideal target should have been 5 to 7%. The red tapes or the competitiveness broadly, I think there are many numbers that were given just on export. I want to touch upon 2 numbers. Time to export, Vietnam, Bangladesh on an average is 168 hours per consignment. Vietnam is 55 hours. Time to import, 216 hours. Bangladesh, Vietnam is 56 hours. 1/4 to 1/5 level of, and fungibility or economic complexity, whereby Vietnam used its knowledge and market gains in RMG sector to develop its footwear sector, where we fell behind. I'll just take 2 more minutes to shed light on my final broad points, which is all said and done. Let's say we come to a point where we have our policymakers, private sectors, and broader stakeholders agree on these lessons and agree to implement those. Can Bangladesh effectively replicate? What does our experience and track record say? I like to highlight a few points which are going to be critical in order for us to effectively replicate these lessons. First, prioritization. Our export policy has 13 high priority sectors. Industrial policy has 12. That's 25. Some are common. We have taken almost 40 years to get to international competitiveness level for one sector, ready-made garments. Can we do it for 20 sectors? Certainly not. So there needs to be prioritization for focused policy and resource allocation. Timeliness to response. That is a big problem. The business and the export, particularly international trade landscape, is very dynamic. Policy response need to be very timely. But if we look at Bangladesh's some of the track records, such as implementation of the port infrastructure that has been in need for last 10 years, we can see how sort of we have been performing. Special economic zones, which have now been progressing extremely well. But very, very few people know that for a long period between 2011 and 2013, not much could have been done just because the rules were not provided to operationalize the SEZ law, excellent law that came in 2010. Reform implementation, we often take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think trade liberalization or trade policy is a great example whereby I think the protectionist agenda has been increasing. But in terms of legal reforms as well, enforcement of contract has been seriously hurting the investor confidence. And we have made a change in our civil procedure code in 2012. In 8 years, we could not operationalize the reform law. And finally, the FDI mindset that many very rightly talk about. I just wanted to give you one example. Logistics sector, very few of us, we know that perhaps that 100%, let alone 100%, even majority foreign investment is not allowed in logistics sector. A foreign investor can have at the maximum 49% equity in any logistics investment. So bringing in the heavy duty inputs like finance, capital, technology, business, do we think these foreign investors are going to really come into logistics sector? And I have experienced this firsthand while negotiating for my extended or broader family with one of the top 3 shipping lines in the world who want to come in and set up in joint venture an Indian container terminal in Chittagong, whereby everything has been agreed, but one barrier is not allowing it to go through, that they need a majority which has been agreed upon, and 49% is what they can have, and they say they are not going to come. And that is, we are looking at a $75 million investment, but more than that, trade facilitation. So I'll stop there, and I congratulate once again the authors of this report, which is an excellent, timely, and very relevant to Bangladesh's own agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Masroor. You've put in a lot of material, a lot of food for thought here, and prioritization, replication, the challenge of replication of the good policies that we see around and from Vietnam. These are challenges, no doubt. I really, from the business perspective, you've got, the things that you've talked about, they are really high priority things. But I will raise the first fundamental question in economics. Producers export if they find that it is the price of they get from export is higher than the price they get from the domestic market. That's the fundamental proposition of economics. Unfortunately, in Bangladesh, and I'm not talking about the ready-made garment sector, for the other sectors, including Mr. Nasim Manzoor's sector, he knows where the shoe pinches really. That fundamental proposition is misguided in Bangladesh. When they try to export, they find that it's not that profitable. Okay, let us now move on. We've got really very distinguished audience around here, and I would like to first invite Mr. Sadiq Ahmad, former finance minister, has been signed on for a very long time. So may I invite Mr. Sadiq Ahmad, sir, for sharing some of your ideas with us on this very relevant subject that we are challenged with.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sadiq Ahmad, and I would like to thank the PRI for inviting me to this function where I learned and heard many things which I did not know about Vietnam. And I convey my respects to the Honorable Minister for Finance, Minister for Planning, whose office will be responsible for making policies and in their implementation based on today's discussions. And my respects to Professor Rahman Soban, who has been my friend, boss, and whatnot. I would like to especially thank Dr. Sadiq for the manner in which he presented the papers. I'm interested in Vietnam because of the reason that after I retired from the government in December 87, the Swedish SIDA and the UNDP, they requested me to go to Vietnam to help them in preparing some policies in some areas. So I was very glad to do that, and I have been going there off and on from 89 to 97 actually. The areas in which they wanted me to advise them, I can read out, the institution of State Committee on Planning for Cooperation and Investment, Then identification of projects and sectors for foreign aid, aid coordination and management, and economic reforms and monetary and fiscal policy reforms, effectiveness of monetary policy in Vietnam in promoting exports. And then it was deceleration of inflation with acceleration of price reforms. And I must say an interesting thing, that the main areas where they wanted me to help and advise them were these aid coordination and management and identification of projects and projects for foreign aid. And the minister in charge was Mr. Phan Van Khai, who was the head of the State Committee on Planning for Cooperation and Investment. Anyway, what happened actually, I went there in 1989, and later on I have been following the Vietnam economy quite well from time to time until recently. The economy of Vietnam, as you find in the PRI's paper, is a socialist-minded market economy. As already we have heard from the discussions, it has many corporations: Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, ASEAN, now WTO in 2007, and now very recently the European Union. They have entered into an agreement in 2020. They started the negotiation in 2015. In the last data that I saw, Vietnam is the 37th largest GDP and 23rd on the basis of purchasing power parity. This is very interesting. These figures are probably 2 years old. Some of the papers that I had, I just looked into this. Now, economic structure of Bangladesh and Vietnam are more or less similar. Agriculture is 15% in Vietnam, also in Bangladesh, 34% in industries and 51% in services. So there are some similarities. There are some common industries between Bangladesh and Vietnam, like textile, footwear, seafood, vegetable, tourism, etc. But Vietnam is well ahead in electronics and machinery, as others have mentioned, steels, food processing, and also, as Jaydeep Sattar mentioned, the second largest exporter of coffee after Brazil. They achieved this in about 15 to 18 years. It's remarkable. In ease of doing business, it is the position of 70th, well ahead of Bangladesh. In FDI, the last figure that I saw, the external investment was $130 billion. And FDI by the Vietnamese entrepreneurs outside the country is about 20 billion. Since the mid-1980s, through this Doi Moi reform period, Vietnam shifted from a highly centralized command economy to a mixed economy. In 2017, PricewaterhouseCoopers included Vietnam in the next 11 fastest growing world economies. And I want to give you a brief history of the colonization of Vietnam. You know, it was colonized by France quite early in the 19th century and used north and south regions of Vietnam for different purposes. North and south were divided politically, but Vietnam is the only country, only poor country, which I mentioned more than once, which defeated in war 3 permanent members of the Security Council. The first one was France in 1954-55. They defeated in war, ousted France. The next one was the USA. In 1975, USA was thrown out of Vietnam. And the last one was China in 1979, when they occupied some areas in the northern part of Vietnam. They threw the Chinese out. So this is a very, very interesting thing. I always, whenever there's an opportunity, I make this statement. Now, what happened after that is that after 1975, when the country was united, in, North and South were united in all respects. And after reunification, there was imbalance in supply and demand. And this soaring inflation, raising debt problem. They wanted to see the end of this sharp economic deterioration in spite of the third five-year plan under Doi Moi, 81-85. They were looking for ODA, which was very significant in those days because it was a poor country, official development assistance, international support with technical assistance, institution building, advice, etc. And the reason behind the situation between 1975 and 1994 was that US imposed a trade embargo on Vietnam for 20 years. In 1986, Doi Moi, about which we have heard, political and economic renewal campaign started transition from a centralized economy to a socialist-oriented market economy. The policy changes that are brought in are free market incentives, encouraging private business and foreign investment, including foreign-owned enterprises. In about 1980, the Industrial Act of Bangladesh was passed, if you remember, during Ziaur Rahman's time. And he said, money is not problem. This is one thing he said. The second thing he said, I shall make politics difficult for politicians. So in the process, whatever progress was made in the early 80s, things were completely reversed because of the killing of new international economic order and bringing in this what is called structural readjustment and policy reforms by the World Bank and the IMF. This Bangladesh had to go through these policy reforms, trade policy reforms, financial policy reform, banking policy reforms, and so on. Vietnam handled the Asian financial crisis of 1997 quite well, only through GDP, heavily through GDP growth rate, which even though the GDP growth rate declined, they were able to handle the financial crisis quite well. In July 2000, US and UN signed the bilateral trade agreement first, after 1975. And a significant step it was, because other industrial organizations and trades globally, they also felt encouraged to Vietnam's request. And as you all know, and it was mentioned by Sadiq also, Vietnam became a member of the WTO in 2007. And now only recently, FTA with the European Union, they have, as I think another panelist mentioned, their association with several free trade areas like ASEAN, ASEANZA, including Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, Japan Comprehensive Economic Production Partnership Act, European Union, Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, as I said, initiated in 2015, but came into effect in August 2020. According to the DBS Bank report, this is I think 2019, by the next decade, Vietnam can overpower Singapore in economy because of strong investment and productivity growth. This is very important, this productivity growth.
Thank you, sir.
The top manufacturing sectors, especially electronics, food processing, chemicals and footwear goods experience rapid growth because of this change in policies. Some economics suggest that it is the benefit from its proximity to China with lower labor costs that Vietnam is becoming a top manufacturing hub in Asia, especially for Korea and Japanese firms. And that's why they're getting this foreign investment. Now, I want to finally say one thing, which is very interesting. after all that I said about Vietnam well ahead of Bangladesh, I saw in a recent report by the Transparency International, a non-profit that tracks graft, as we all know, ranking Vietnam as 113th worst out of 176 countries. So that is one area we're probably ahead of Vietnam. So
Okay.
corruption, something
Thank you.
which does not spare anyone,
Yeah,
whether it is
right.
Vietnam or Bangladesh or Korea or Japan. So I think I should stop here. And
Thank
thank you
you.
again. Thank you again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. You bring new perspective. You've spent so much time in Vietnam. You rightly pointed out that Vietnam was, used to be a command economy, but then they turned into a socialist economy with market orientation, a new time. It is now my privilege and pleasure to invite one of the luminaries in our economic horizon, Professor Rehman Saban. You should know, sir, that I'm one of the few living, practicing economists who happen to be your direct student. So, Professor Rehman Saban, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zeddy. I remember you well. You were a very good student. I would begin by drawing attention to the king of the Zoom empire, none other than Mr. Manan, minister and MP, that for quite a number of years in his presence, when he and his finance minister of that time have been in a particularly self-congratulatory mode about our 8% or 7% GDP growth rate. I was always suggesting that they should attempt to make some comparisons with what actually had happened in Vietnam before they got too carried away by their achievements. So I'm now particularly happy to note and compliment PRI that you have now attempted to put this relationship in some sort of perspective. And I hope Mr. Manan, when he is in a particularly elated mood about his achievements, will take due note of the evidence which has been put on the table, because we were, as you can see, at a comparative level for quite a long time, and in fact, possibly even ahead of Vietnam. Now, I would just make a few points of relevance over here. I think I stayed up quite late reading your full report, Sadiq, and it was very informative for me. Now, what I noticed, in fact, attempting to look at even the small print, is that one idea which is now quite fashionable, it wasn't once, was conspicuous by your absence in the analysis, and that is the word governance. And there was no real attempt to really try to address the significant variations in governance capacity and outcomes between Vietnam and Bangladesh. Had you in fact moved down that road, you might have begun your narrative by going back to the case of Young One. In fact, I don't know if you are all familiar with the Young One Sam's export processing zone case, which goes back to 1996 when Awami League first came into office, where in fact they were setting up an export processing zone, and they were particularly interested in bringing in Korean investment into that zone. And this goes back, as I said, to 1996. It is 2021. To the best of my knowledge, no final agreement on allocating land and giving Young One title to that land has still been made, though it may have been made in the last year or so, but it hadn't been made until recently. Now, I mention this because the relevant point is that at some point while these negotiations were going on, Young One had negotiated with Samsung to actually come to Bangladesh and in fact invest in setting up their plant for producing mobile phones. And it was the failure of that negotiation or the failure of their conclusion to be able to get the export processing zone approved that compelled Samsung to then go to Vietnam. Now, as the figures which Sadiq has provided in his paper show the spectacular contribution of Samsung to the export revolution, particularly in electronics to Vietnam, you can see the opportunity cost to Bangladesh. So possibly finance minister who is also in charge of Ahmed, planning minister, may in fact initiate a historic inquiry as to why that happened and what lessons does it tell you about the functioning of the Bangladesh governance process. Now, this essentially brings me to the relevant questions where you've put a lot of information on actually the different indicators of Vietnam's performance, and you have made some attempt to establish causality between one set of indices and the other. But what I noticed was still to be identified, and here Nehad briefly touched on it, is the whys and hows of why this actually happened. And this was the relevant lesson to be learned from a deconstruction of the experience of Samsung and Bangladesh and the failure to operationalize a Korean export processing zone for 25 years, which could have been bringing in billions of dollars, not just from Samsung, but from other Korean companies as well. Now here, I wish to further draw your attention to the fact that a lot of discussion has been made. Certainly it was made in your presentation, Sadiq, but also it has been made by others about the number of various trade agreements and FTAs or quasi-FTAs signed by Vietnam compared to us, implying that this was somehow a very important factor. But we somehow seem to have forgotten that actually Bangladesh had GSP access to the US market for a very long time before we got cut off. We had EBA to the EU market for almost 2 decades or so. And since 2010, when Manmohan Singh granted Bangladesh finally, after a long process of both civil society and intergovernmental lobbying, duty-free access to the Indian market. So we had many of the advantages which in Vietnam, through a protracted process of negotiation, which included having to give up domestic concessions, which we never had to do, because we were given unilateral market access in all these carriers. Remember, EU constitutes a large number of countries. Why we never could take advantage of this? After all, everything which Vietnam did in a very dramatic fashion in terms of both export growth and diversification took place in the last 15 years. I was looking at your export diversification table, Sadiq, in product diversification, and also the Hirschman index, and seeing that compared to Bangladesh, Vietnam and Bangladesh were on par up to 2005. And it is only since 2005 that there has been an exponential growth in Vietnam compared to us. So we aren't really talking about very long periods. Now, in all this period, we had many of the opportunities which Vietnam are now acquiring. And one should not become too obsessed with all these FTAs, because there is a lot of small print attached to these FTAs, even within ASEAN itself, in terms of the ways in which particular levels of protection in NTBs are really exercised to in fact frustrate the full operation. So please take a very careful look at all these agreements which are signed to see exactly what concessions are granted to you. I'm sure Vietnam will have to go through many loops and hurdles before it gets all the benefits of full market access to the US market or even to the European market. But as I said, we had these opportunities, and where were we? Now, I don't know if Rubana is still around. If she is, I would ask her, so what exactly were you doing for the last 15 years? After all, you are one of the leading exporters. You claim that you have got only 5 products which you now have specialized in. You have given a particular index for that sort of diversity. Why were you not diversifying yourself? You have asked that question, but
Sir,
you and all your associates,
heavily diversified
what was your
already.
problem? Huh?
Heavily diversified. I have heavily diversified into energy, into software,
No,
into
I was
real
wanting to, I
estate.
said, why were you not diversifying your own RMG export?
Well,
That was the relevant point. This is what I want to know. Correspondingly, if you had GSP access to the US, if you had duty-free access to the Indian market, and if you had EBA access to the European Union, where you could have exported everything under the sun to these countries, well, what was restraining our diversification? Suddenly you are introducing these as a significant variable in determining the way in which Vietnam diversified. But what is the relevant explanation for why this did not happen inside Bangladesh? This is the point I wish to make. Now, this would take you back to the question then of what were the key factors which could bring all this about? As people are talking now about diplomacy, but Vietnam was a very narrowly diplomatically connected country, is a communist country. Most of the people could barely speak English. Their concept of diplomacy was itself sort of pretty much a product in the making. After all, how many times have you ever met a Vietnam ambassador and been able to have a coherent conversation with him on any subject? Now, how come these poor guys who could neither speak English nor have any experience in diplomacy would outrank all the brilliant diplomats and the brilliant foreign ministers, which in fact have presided over Bangladesh's diplomatic relations for so many years, managed to bring about all these significant breakthroughs when we have been talking about economic diplomacy for at least 40 or 50 years, going back possibly even to the time of Ziaur Rahman. This again is a relevant question which needs to be answered over here.
Thank you, sir.
Now,
yeah, thank you for pointing out.
The last point I would like to make over here is that, again, you have to ask yourself, what are the key elements which gave them the capacity to do so? What was happening in that infrastructure development program, which enabled them to improve their logistics in a highly controlled, regulated economy? What is the rate of speed of construction of big highways and infrastructure projects compared to Bangladesh? What is the cost per unit for the construction of these? What is the time delays which are taken over here? These would have been relevant issues which merited discussion. So I conclude by saying that what you really have to address over here is how and why this happened. I mean, we know the numbers. These can all be accessed if you have a good Google capacity, and you can download all this information. But what you don't really know is what actually this communist state was doing. And how could they have the highest rates of labor productivity in public enterprises, which is now you may say a swear word in Bangladesh, which no one even mentions without being severely sort of castigated.
Thank you, sir. Good,
What did
good
we
point,
do
sir.
to our public enterprise, and what did they do to
Very
our
good.
public enterprise? Answer these questions, and then you will really get a proper explanation for the differential performance which has actually taken place. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So you've made very, very excellent points as always, sir. Lot of food for thought.
Dr. Zaidi, I just
Uh,
wanted to make one point. I just saw this morning that while our GDP, tax GDP ratio is about 8%, Vietnam's tax GDP ratio is 26%.
26%. Yes, sir.
26%.
That's another striking difference. Dr. Sadiq wants to come in.
As the lead researcher of this, and Professor Ahmed, who was my professor, he was also my first employer. He invited me from Dhaka University to join BIDS, and then introduced me to Professor Ahmed, who took me then to LSE. So I have a lot of respect and regard for Professor Ahmed, who had a major contribution in my career growth. I think his interventions are relevant. The political economy and governance aspects were not discussed on purpose, because this was requested by the Ministry of Commerce as a technical study. And the idea was that political economy questions will be answered when it comes to implementation, and that will be designed jointly with the government. That second phase has not happened.
Thank you. Thank you.
On the issue of FTA, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding. I think the whole presentation assured that this was a comprehensiveness of the policy package that helped, not just an FTA. Look at the macroeconomic management, exchange rate management, trade logistics, the tariff reforms, the investment in R&D and technology, and etc. What the FTAs did was not just create a market, but it forced a political discipline to enforce the reforms. And that is what is missing in Bangladesh. We can talk offline again. Thank you.
Correct, absolutely. It was the FTAs that locked in several of these reforms. Thank you so much. We are really running out of time.
Zaidi and Sadiq, the point I wish to make is, how could they so effectively implement these reforms? Not that you are putting a reform on paper, but what was the capacity demonstrated for the actual implementation? And how did they deal with the obstacles for operationalizing reform?
You're absolutely right, sir. But it would need a much longer discussion, but we are running out of time right now. And I would like to give the minister, the honorable minister, at least 15 minutes to share his thoughts. But I have Dr. Salim Raihan has been, Dr. Salim Rahman, Professor Mustafizur Rahman, they have been, they want to share their ideas. So I would love to invite Dr. Salim Rahman, Executive Director of SANEM. Could you please put your ideas in a very brief statement, please?
Thank you so much. Actually, I think I should not actually talk now because time is a big constraint, and Honorable Minister. So actually, after Professor Sovan speaks, I should not extend anything. So please, over to you, Dr. Zaidi. Thank you so much for excellent presentation.
You must make at least one point, Salim.
One point.
Just one point. Make one point.
I think one, of course, after this excellent presentation of Dr. Sadiq Ahmed and of course you and Dr. Razak, that paper, I thought that the point made by Professor Demonstration was very much valid, especially the political economy understanding of this whole dynamics. I think it was kind of missing in this. And I take Dr. Sadiq Ahmed's answer, maybe because of the kind of keyword he had. But I look forward to that political economy analysis. Thank you.
Sure. That's a good point. Thank you very much, Salim. And may I now invite Professor Mustafiz again? Just request you.
Yeah.
Just one brief point.
Yeah. Just very brief, two points, because Honorable Minister has been with us for so long. Before going to the political economy factor, I would also like to point out that from the perspective of policies also, Vietnam was very activist, in policy making, the government. If you look at Vietnam's, and Sadiq Bhai has, I think, rightly also mentioned, Vietnam was pursuing strategic investment and trade policies. And they were doing it in a very cleverly crafted way. I was looking at the trade policy review done by the WTO in 2021 April. And one can see how they are trying to also manipulate within the WTO. they provided 84 notifications to the W2 that we are doing this, knowing that this may be a bit of an aberration, but then alerting them that we are doing this. I'll give you just one example. For example, if the MFN tariff rate, Zaidi bhai, 2013, Vietnam's MFN tariff rate average rate was 11.9, 10.3%. In 2021, it increased, in fact, to 11.9%. So they were trying to also safeguard some of the sectors. In terms of investment, they have a 25% local value addition procurement requirement. So what I'm telling is that they are also, very clever in terms of manipulating and in terms of, adjusting to the various requirements, which Bangladesh will also be required to do. And that's what some of your discussions also mentioned, that we will have to cleverly craft our policies in view of LDC graduation. And also last point is incentive, recalibration of the incentives. Vietnam was doing it, very cleverly as they progress. The revised enterprise law of Vietnam is 2021. They have revised it. Revised investment law 2021. They are doing it in a continuing basis. So my point is that even in the context of designing policies, we will have to be very clever, and then of course the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good points, Professor Mustafiz. No question that we have to be very smart. You have to be smart in this world of international trade. And now I would have liked to hear many more. There's about 70 participants still on, but I really apologize. We've just run out of time. I have to give at least 15 minutes time to our Honorable Minister to share his thoughts. He has listened to us for such long time. I have to give him that scope. And before ending, I'd like to acknowledge the partnership with the FNF, who really supported this particular presentation. And I also have to acknowledge that, the idea of this particular research really came out of the former Commerce Secretary, Dr. Jafaruddin, who's now the CEO of the Bangladesh Foreign Trade Institute. He was very keen on finding out exactly what Vietnam was doing and what Bangladesh could do if Vietnam has been succeeding in export expansion in this great way. May I now have the pleasure to invite the Honorable Minister for Planning, Mr. Ahmed Mannan, MP, who has been very kind, very generous time to us. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, sir. Let me begin by thanking the distinguished audience here for being present all through this long session and discussing a very important issue. It's my privilege and I feel I'm highly honored that I could be present in this session and listen to all the discussions which are very important to my job, to my profession, and to my position that I am here instantly at this moment. Let me say this, the initiate, that as a guest, my role is limited here, and I'm not a discussant in the sense that others have been. And they're also professionals in their own fields, the business fields, in academics, and in other things. So I'm going to make some very, what I would say, very general comments from political point of view. This Vietnam, somehow, for the last 5-7 years that I have been in this job, and I have attended some meetings here and there, we always come up with this comparison with Vietnam, and an obsession here in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, in all seminars. I would like to know much more on Vietnam, and I would like to know what the differences are really. And so in that light, the paper presented by Dr. Sadiq today, he written a book on that. I thank him for his write-up, and I have listened to the discussion this morning here. I want to just, this has been touched by Mr. Said Zaman and Professor Rahman Subhan also. The whole political, cultural aspect of the background of the thing between Vietnam and us. Vietnam is a one-party state. We are not. that will have to be kept in the discussion, I think. As a result of one-party state, the stability, the homogeneity, and the continuity, consistency of policies, and focusing on targeting on issues of concern in Hanoi and in similarly in Dhaka are quite different. And scholars here, like Sadiq Ahmad and Dr. Zahid Sattar and others, I would humbly say that this matter would have to be given proper weightage. From my point of view, I think. Another aspect that I'm curious about, we have been colonized much longer than Vietnamese have been. They have had much briefer French occupation, and they beat them, which was great. Beat them physically. We didn't beat the British, but that left a very positive mark in their mind. And they beat the Americans also. That's really two great feathers in the cap. I was surprised hearing Mr. Said's one about the Chinese incident, which I thought was a border skirmish only. That was my knowledge. But anyway, I give them credit for that also. Another thing that strange, the occupiers, the French, more the US, following the defeat, their sense of guilt, or I don't know, whatever it is, they went all out to stand by Vietnam, particularly the Americans, and there's concessions in various ways given to Vietnam by US administration serially to win over back or to sort of repair the hurt which they had caused. Gave them a great opportunity to the Vietnamese in terms of trade and exports, which was a great boost for them. Vietnamese again here, you gave the figures from 1990. It's very interesting to note. In 1990, in every parameters, we were better than them. But in exports, they are much better than us. In 1990, their exports were 2.3 billion and ours was 1.9. So they're very close, but quite a bit of difference. So which means they had a head start there in export, because you are talking about export-led growth. So in that light, although they were way back in other factors, but in this field, they are way ahead. So this, I would like to sort of, shed light on that aspect. Another thing that I would like to say here is that occupiers built up a lot of infrastructures to beat them. When they left the infrastructure which the Vietnamese could readily use, roads and electricity and various other things, which they found ready, for which they didn't have to invest. We had to invest for every kilometer. We had to invest for every kilometer of power lines. But the Americans, as much as I have heard, had built up thousands of miles of roads in various ways to seek them out and beat them. So that became a positive aspect in favor of the Vietnamese after the Americans had left.
Manan, I want to, wait a minute.
Yes.
Manan, I wish to draw one point of information to your attention. When the war ended, North Vietnam had been bombed back to the Stone Age by the Americans. And they did not do anything to develop the infrastructure of Vietnam. So I do not know where you have got that information.
So the southern part, I'm meaning the southern part, which was way behind the northern part. Southern part had been built for for military purposes by the Americans, which they could readily use. But then I don't want to enter into argument. This, bombing back into Stone Age in case of Afghanistan, in case of Iraq, and in case of Vietnam. These are figures of speech, and we'll have to be taken with a pinch of salt. But sir, due respect to you, of course, there is a lot of truth in that. Another thing I would like to know from Dr. Sadiq, power generation. Where were they in 1990 and where were we in 1990? The huge gap that we had to cover, particularly our government had to cover since 2009-10. I would like to know this difference sometimes, so that that is a very important factor, I think, in this situation. our power gap. And then, of course, another thing that I would like to, I don't know, I'm a bit sort of scared here to mention this. The savings that our economy generated, a lot of it has to go to investments. But do we invest in the real world or we invested in the spiritual world? It's a very important to me. I feel it's something very interesting. We are investing in the spiritual world. They are investing in wherever they produced in the physical world. They invested in the physical world. We invested a larger part of our savings in the spiritual world. I have no quarrel with that. I got for that. But that you as economists who do with numbers and figures, please bring that out also. You can't play hide and seek with the truths of life. So this is another point that I would like to, in my own very generalist way, I'm trying to bring this point to you. These incentives and subsidies, I would like that you also give us shed some light on that. Our economy, the one that we are now tending to, how much we pay in terms of incentives and subsidies and what we get out of that. Very hard studies required there. Do they do it in Vietnam? I don't know. I'm not aware of that. How much incentives or subsidies they give. So there's a cost to that also. That cost will have to be factored in, I think. So from Dr. Sadiq, I would like to hear on that also. Nazneen has mentioned a point about Dr. Nazneen about foreign policy aspects of this trade and this. Yeah, it's very well known. Vietnamese foreign policy and our foreign policy. Vietnamese foreign policy was completely focused on building a bridge with the Americans following the debacle. And Americans being the superpower, Americans being the highest importers, Americans being the highest in everything. So this relationship, it initially hate, it turned into love. So hate to love is a very positive move. Love to hate is a very negative move. Vietnamese enjoyed this hate to love, and they have made much out of that also, I think. That is also, sometimes overlooked. We have never had any love-hate. We have always had hate. For the last 1,000 years or so, more or less. Sometimes very loud, sometimes very low level, but always negative, hate. Colonizers, this or that way. So this will have to be spoken out now. Time has come. It's very interesting thing. This is the last point that I would like to be highly technical. I am not very clear about the aspect. Currency manipulation and how they cleverly use their reserves or use their currency. We have a fairly large reserve, it seems, from the reports that I come across every day. So is there a way that we could use it to our benefit in the way they did? And what are the clever ways they used, and what are the clever ways that we can learn from them and use? If it makes sense in terms of your, if it makes economic sense. So this is an area that I would like to hear from Dr. Sadiq later, so that we can learn from here also. Last but not the least, governance. Professor Raman Suban's very favorite issue. Everyone's favorite issue in Dhaka and Bangladesh now. Our favorite issue also, but the depth differs. We are not as deep as many of them are. What is this? How do they score in this governance table? Do they score better than us, or we are better than them? If we are better than them, then you give us some points for that also, so that the whole league table is properly, placed, so that our weaknesses and our strengths are also put up. So these are the few points that I want to say. I'm not an economist. I did make a proper study of the subject. Having heard from you on various occasions, I picked up here and there, and so these are my presentations this afternoon. And thank you very much for the time and the opportunity to be able to join with you and speak. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your time, for your dedication, and your friendship with Policy Research Institute. may I just break from tradition? There's a gentleman from Vietnam. He's a deputy resident representative of the UNDP, Mr. Van Nguyen. May I invite him to say some last few words? Because we talked about Vietnam, and here was someone from Vietnam. Mr. Van Nguyen, would you like to share your thoughts very briefly, please? I'm breaking from tradition, and I have the permission of the Honorable Minister. Would you like to say just a few words? Thank you.
Good afternoon. So good afternoon, Minister. I'm so happy to be joining with you all this morning, and thanks to Dr. Nasneen, who gave me that access. And when she mentioned about this, I said, could you please share with me the link so that I would like to join? I have to say that I am so happy to listen to very attentively to the conversation that you have this morning. It's very highly stimulating, both in terms of intellectual, but also very strategic. And I could already see the very nice future, green future ahead of us all here in Bangladesh, because I think that the most important thing for us is that we know where we are and when we know where we need to be. So you are in this situation, and being a Vietnamese, I have been away from my own country for very long term, and therefore I also learned from the conversation today about how my country is doing. What I would like, because you give me the floor, so I just would like to say that I am fully in agreement with all the important points that you have made from everyone, including our, honorable minister just now. And let me take this opportunity not only talk as a Vietnamese, but also as a UNDP staff, that we would be very humble and very privileged if we are given an opportunity to work together side by side with the government of Bangladesh, with the business of Bangladesh, to bring Bangladesh, go to the future that we are all looking for. I see that Vietnam has gone a long way. When I was back home in Vietnam with UNDP, we talk a lot about the middle income trap, and so now with Bangladesh, with LDC graduation, our country program document of UNDP in the next 5 years will be focusing on only 2 areas. One is sustainable recovery from the COVID, and second is sustainable graduation of the LDC. So we will be with you. We thank you for giving me the floor, and I'm so sorry. I know the protocol. I should not be the one who speaks, but I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your words. And now we also have the permission of the Honorable Minister. Dr. Sadiq would like to conclude, say some concluding words. Dr. Sadiq.
Thank you, distinguished participants, Professor Ahmed, Dr. Said Zaman, and everybody else. We take a lot of feedback, very valuable feedback from all of the participants. Particularly, I take this message of governance and political economy very seriously. May I suggest the minister is here? If the minister would like to sponsor a study of the political economy of Vietnam, I'll be glad to take that on and present to you the findings when it's done. On the issue, the main message that I'd like to leave here, apart from political economy, is that good policies have good outcomes. I think there is no magic in development. If we expect that somebody from the Allah will do it or globally will do it without any effort, that is what I want to dispel that. If you don't do good policies, you'll not get good results. If you have a 9% of GDP of taxes, you cannot finance social protection, you cannot finance human development, you cannot finance infrastructure, period. So I think there are some very important, if you have an exchange rate which appreciates in real terms to close to 90% over 10 and 12 years, don't blame the exporters. What will they do? If you have only a pocket of special treatment of one sector, RMG, and leave the rest of the economy, you'll never get a diversification. So I think there are some core messages that come out of Vietnam's experience that we need to take to heart. Really about how it happened and why it happened and why Bangladesh can, what Bangladesh can do in implementation. I think very good question. That's the next step. And I would like to be all depending on the government sector. I will close that. And thank you all for your participation and hope to have this conversation and all the points that were made by discussants, including those who send comments to the chat room and the question answer, we'll take that and we'll try to incorporate as much as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Sattar. Thank you, everybody who participated, and my apologies to all those participants whom I could not give time. And thanks to our partner for this event, Friedman Newman Foundation of Germany, who have been generous enough to support us for this event. Thank you, all my special guests, of course, the Honorable Minister, and my 4 special guests I've had, and some leading members from the business community, and of course, Mr. Saiduzzahman, former finance minister, Professor Rehman Soman. Everybody knows you, and you taught us. So this is the economics that we are now generating from the halls of Dhaka University. Thank you, everybody, and a very good afternoon. Sorry to take up so much of your time. You've been very kind to stay with us. There's almost 50, 60 audience still signed up. Again, as I end, I really apologize, sincerely apologize to all those people who had sent me questions, but I could not give time. But we will respond. Thank you very much, and goodbye.